The IDF is preparing for an invasion of Rafah as peace negotiations between Hamas and Israel have stalled. I'm Jerome Starkey, this is World at War, and my guest today is General Sir Richard Barrons, one of Britain's foremost military minds and a former Joint Chief of the UK's Armed Forces. General Sir Richard, thank you for joining us. What does Israel hope to achieve? Can they end the war? Can they win the war with this planned offensive in Rafah?
So Israel believes there are 3 battalions of Hamas in Rafah, and so they can't claim to have defeated Hamas until they've dealt with those 3 battalions. But if they do that, and it looks like they will, they are already finding that in places in Gaza, which they believe they had cleared Hamas out of, Hamas is able to regenerate. So we're coming back to the point we all made on the 7th of October last year, which is you can't kill an idea and you can't destroy an organization like Hamas. You can make it much weaker, but you can't destroy it. So we're about to have to live with the fact that Israel has crunched through the whole of Gaza at an enormous cost, 35,000 civilian casualties so far, and will have broken the Hamas infrastructure that it can find, so tunnels, headquarters, dumps, and the people who choose to fight. But Hamas as an organization, as an idea, will of course continue to exist.
What can Israel do? If you were commanding the IDF, what would you be advising Netanyahu to do now? He has said he wants to crush Hamas and he will not stop until they are destroyed. What would your advice as a military man be to Netanyahu and his government?
So I would say 3 things. First, I've done what you asked. I have gone through Gaza and I have broken the Hamas military machine as much as I could find it. Secondly, but that doesn't mean I've destroyed Hamas. I'm now going to have to deal with Hamas reappearing, albeit in smaller numbers and at different places of its own choosing, for as long as I remain in Gaza. Do I want to remain in Gaza? And the third thing I would say, well, now we need to change this and convert it from a military success into a political victory. And that means finding a way forward for Gaza, which is nothing to do with the armed forces.
What will happen if they go into Rafah? I mean, I'm asking you to predict the future, but how do you see that unfolding?
So the military challenge is there are about 1 million Palestinian civilians sitting in your target area. And you would very much prefer that they opted to move away. And I would maybe even offer to bus them north. And about 300,000 apparently have moved. And then I've really got a choice. I could reapply some of the tactics I've used in northern Gaza, which is about whole-scale destruction. And when I do that, I know I'm going to kill a lot more civilians because they are just going to be in the way. And we have seen how much of the world is suggesting that isn't the best possible way of going forward. So probably what I'm going to do is try and be more precise. I'm going to try and find specific Hamas targets who are not going to volunteer themselves for this, and then engage in precision strikes from range and precision raids using ground forces that go into Rafah and come out. My objective is to destroy 3 battalions without killing Palestinian citizens. That's going to be really difficult.
Whenever I raise the civilian casualties argument, I'm told by those who support the IDF and those who support its objectives, understandable after the atrocities on October 7th, that these civilian casualties are not Israel's fault, they are Hamas's fault. Hamas is hiding amongst the civilian population. They are holding Israeli hostages. If they released the hostages, this would go. If they surrendered, this would go away and no civilians would be killed. I mean, is that a realistic, or is that a credible defense of
the Israeli line has been completely consistent throughout its intervention in Gaza. It means to destroy Hamas because Hamas is an existential risk to security in Israel, and that's going to come at a price to the damage to the habitat in Gaza and the civilians who are caught up in the fighting. And the Israeli forces will argue that Hamas has done its level best to make sure civilians are close to their fighters. And we come back to this lawful position of is your military action necessary discriminate and proportionate. That is a matter of judgment. And if you're in the Israeli Defense Forces, you believe, and there may be exceptions in behavior, but you believe you have stuck to that. If you are a Palestinian citizen caught in the fighting, and many other people who support the Palestinian case around the world, then they are not going to agree with you. But the fact is, the stakes are really high here, both for Israel and for Palestine, and that's why you're seeing the sort of war you're seeing.
Richard, as a military man, I mean, you're familiar that when British troops operate, they have incredibly strict rules of engagement. I've been with them on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan where they have absolutely sort of prescribed rules on who they can shoot in what circumstances. They have to be shot at first in some cases. Having watched this war unfold, do you agree with the Israeli assertion that they do more than any other army in the world to protect civilians?
So I don't know the detail of the Israeli operation, but the point about rules of engagement is that they are tuned to the operation that you're conducting. So a British military operation in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia, in Iraq and Afghanistan, all of which I took part in, the rules of engagement were geared to what you were trying to do, which was to change the facts on the ground, but in a way that sustained the support of the civil population. And that brings you back to rules of engagement largely based on self-defense. But in the case of Gaza, both parties feel they are at war for existential reasons. And in those circumstances where the survival of your state is in question, you're going to take a different degree of risk. And that is lawful.
In the long run, it appears that Israel, or at least in the medium term, it appears that Israel risks alienating some of its allies. We've seen America, we've seen President Joe Biden withholding the delivery of some of its largest munitions because they're uncomfortable with how they could be used in a Rafah offensive. The British government's main message appears to have been focusing on the humanitarian, the need for more humanitarian assistance. Do you think the British and the American positions are consistent and correct?
So I think both Britain and America are clear that it is going to be extremely difficult to turn whatever sort of military victory the IDF can claim in Gaza into a stable, strategic, political outcome. So there's a real risk that this just makes things worse with no end in sight. And secondly, because of the way this war is going, that it does spiral into a regional conflagration that draws in neighbouring Arab states, Iran and others, at a consequence for global security and the global economy. And nobody wants that either. So we are in a very difficult place.
And I know before you mentioned the operations that you've been involved in and in Mostar, delivering humanitarian aid in Mostar. Is that the priority now? Getting aid into Gaza to try and keep people alive whilst the conflict is ongoing.
So I took part in the UN-led operation to deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Bosnia whilst the war was going on around them in the 1990s. And you're caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, if you can stop people starving, or in the case of Bosnia, freezing in the winter, then it's a reasonable thing to do to see if you can get aid to them without in any way getting caught up in the flow of the war. And what I found then was that the people we delivered aid to were grateful that actually some help had arrived, but they were not slow in pointing out that we had turned up with all this capability. We were keeping them alive, but they may well just get shot or blown up the next day, feeling a little happier. And what they were really saying is, why are you just tinkering with the symptoms of this conflict when you must have the power to make it stop? And that's what I think the dilemma is faced by the UK, the US, Arab states, and many other countries, which is, why aren't you making this stop?
General Sir Richard Barrons, thank you very much for joining me. This is World at War, and I'm Jerome Starkey. If you're watching on YouTube and you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer some of them next week.